The Yellow Streak, a story by Somerset Maugham. The two prahus were dropping easily downstream, one a few yards ahead of the other, and in the first sat the two white men. After 7 weeks on the rivers, they were glad to know that they would lodge that night in a civilized house. To Izzat, who had been in Borneo since the war, the Dayak houses and their feasts were of course an old story. But Campion, though new to the country, and at first amused by the strangeness, hankered too now for chairs to sit on and a bed to sleep in. The Dayaks were hospitable, but no one could say that there was much comfort to be found in their houses, and there was a monotony in the entertainment they offered a guest, which presently grew somewhat wearisome. Every evening, as the travelers reached the landing place, the headman, bearing a flag, and the more important members of the household came down to the river to fetch them. They were led up to the Longhouse, a village really under one roof, built on piles, to which access was obtained by climbing up the trunk of a tree, rudely notched into steps, and to the beating of drums and gongs walked up and down the whole length of it in long procession. On both sides, serried throngs of brown people sat on their haunches and stared silently as the white men passed. Clean mats were unrolled, and the guests seated themselves. The headman brought a live chicken, and holding it by the legs, waved it 3 times over their heads, called the spirits loudly to witness, and uttered an invocation. Then various persons brought eggs. Arak was drunk. A girl, a very small, shy thing with the grace of a flower, but with something hieratic in her immobile face, held a cup to the white man's lips till it was empty, and then a great shout arose. The men began to dance, one after the other, each treading his little measure with his shield and his parang, to the accompaniment of drum and gong. After this had gone on for some time, the visitors were taken into one of the rooms that led off the long platform on which was led the common life of the household, and found their supper prepared for them. The girls fed them with Chinese spoons. Then everyone grew a little drunk, and they all talked till the early hours of the morning. But now their journey was done, and they were on their way to the coast. They had started at dawn. The river then was very shallow and ran clear and bright over a shingly bottom. The trees leaned over it so that above there was only a strip of blue sky. But now it had broadened out, and the men were poling no longer but paddling. The trees, bamboos, wild sago, like huge bunches of ostrich feathers, trees with enormous leaves and trees with feathery foliage like the acacia, coconut trees and areca palms, with their long, straight white stems, the trees on the banks were immensely and violently luxuriant. Here and there, gaunt and naked, was the bare skeleton of a tree struck by lightning or dead of old age, and its whiteness against all that green was vivid. Here and there, rival kings of the forest, tall trees soared above the common level of the jungle. Then there were the parasites. In the fork of 2 branches, great tufts of lush green leaves, or flowering creepers that covered the spreading foliage like a bride's veil. Sometimes they wound round a tall trunk, a sheath of splendor, and threw long, flowering arms from branch to branch. There was something thrilling in the passionate wildness of that eager growth. It had the daring abandon of the nomad rioting in the train of the god. The day wore on, and now the heat was no longer so oppressive. Campion looked at the shabby silver watch on his wrist. It could not be long now before they reached their destination. "What sort of a chap is Hutchinson?" he asked. "I don't know him. I believe he's a very good sort." Hutchinson was the resident in whose house they were to spend the night, and they had sent on a Dayak in a canoe to announce their arrival. "Well, I hope he's got some whiskey. I've drunk enough arak to last me a lifetime." Campion was a mining engineer whom the Sultan on his way to England had met at Singapore, and finding him at a loose end, had commissioned to go to Sembaloo and see whether he could discover any mineral which might be profitably worked. He sent Willis, the resident at Kuala Sola, instructions to afford him every facility, and Willis had put him in the care of Izzat because Izzat spoke both Malay and Dayak like a native. This was the third trip they had made into the interior, and now Campion was to go home with his reports. They were to catch the Sultan Ahmed, which was due to pass the mouth of the river at dawn on the next day, but one, and with any luck, should reach Kuala Sola on the same afternoon. They were both glad to get back to it. There was tennis and golf there, and the club with its billiard tables, food which was relatively good, and the comforts of civilization. Izzat was glad too that he would have other society than Campion's. He gave him a sidelong glance. He was a little man with a big, bald head, and though certainly 50, strong and wiry, he had quick, shining blue eyes and a stubbly grey moustache. He was seldom without an old briar pipe between his broken and discoloured teeth. He was neither clean nor neat. His khaki shorts were ragged and his singlet torn. He was wearing now a battered topee. He had knocked about the world since he was 18 and had been in South Africa, in China, and in Mexico. He was good company. He could tell a story well, and he was prepared to drink and drink again with anyone he met. They had got on very well together, but Izzat had never felt quite at home with him. Though they joked and laughed together, got drunk together, Izzat felt that there was no intimacy between them. For all the cordiality of their relations, they remained nothing but acquaintances. He was very sensitive to the impression he made on others, and behind Campion's joviality, he had felt a certain coolness. Those shining blue eyes had summed him up, and it vaguely irritated Izzat that Campion had formed an opinion of him, and he did not quite know what it was. He was exasperated by the possibility that this common little man did not think entirely well of him. He desired to be liked and admired. He wanted to be popular. He wished the people he met to take an inordinate fancy to him, so that he could either reject them or a trifle condescendingly bestow his friendship on them. His inclination was to be familiar with all and sundry, but he was held back by the fear of a rebuff. Sometimes he had been uneasily conscious that his effusiveness surprised the persons he lavished it on. By some chance he had never met Hutchinson, though of course he knew all about him, just as Hutchinson knew all about him, and they would have many common friends to talk of. Hutchinson had been at Winchester, and Izzat was glad that he could tell him that he had been at Harrow. The prahu rounded a bend in the river, and suddenly, standing on a slight eminence, they saw the bungalow. In a few minutes they caught sight of the landing stage, and on it, among a little group of natives, a figure in white, waving to them. Hutchinson was a tall, stout man with a red face. His appearance led you to expect that he was breezy and self-confident, so that it was not a little surprising to discover quickly that he was diffident and even a trifle shy. When he shook hands with his guests, Izzat introduced himself and then Campion, and led them up the pathway to the bungalow. Though he was plainly anxious to be civil, it was not hard to see that he found it difficult to make conversation. He took them out onto the veranda, and here they found on the table glasses and whiskey and soda. They made themselves comfortable on long chairs. Izzat, conscious of Hutchinson's slight embarrassment with strangers, expanded. He was very hearty and voluble. He began to speak of their common acquaintances at Kuala Sola, and he managed very soon to slip in casually the information that he had been at Harrow. "You were at Winchester, weren't you?" he asked. "Yes." "I wonder if you knew George Parker." "He was in my regiment." "He was at Winchester. I dare say he was younger than you." Izzat felt that it was a bond between them that they had been at these particular schools, and it excluded Campion, who obviously had enjoyed no such advantage. They drank 2 or 3 whiskies. Izzat in half an hour began to call his host Hutchie. He talked a good deal about my regiment in which he had got his company during the war, and what good fellows his brother officers were. He mentioned 2 or 3 names, which could hardly be unknown to Hutchinson. They were not the sort of people that Campion was likely to have come across, and he was not sorry to administer to him a neat snub when he claimed acquaintance with someone he spoke of. "Billy Meadows? I knew a fellow called Billy Meadows in Sinaloa many years ago," said Campion. "Oh, I shouldn't think it could be the same," said Izzard with a smile. "Billy's by way of being a peer of the realm. He's the Lord Meadows who races. Don't you remember he owned Spring Carrots?" Dinner time was approaching, and after a wash and brush-up, they drank a couple of gin pahits. They sat down. Hutchinson had not been to Kuala Sola for the best part of a year and had not seen another white man for 3 months. He was anxious to make the most of his visitors. He could give them no wine, but there was plenty of whiskey, and after dinner he brought out a precious bottle of Benedictine. They were very gay. They laughed and talked a great deal. Izzard was getting on famously. He thought he had never liked a fellow more than Hutchinson, and he pressed him to come down to Kuala Sola as soon as he could. They would have a wonderful beano. Campion was left out of the conversation by Izzard with the faintly malicious intention of putting him in his place, and by Hutchinson through shyness. And presently, after yawning a good deal, he said he would go to bed. Hutchinson showed him to his room, and when he returned, Izzard said to him, "You don't want to turn in yet, do you?" "Not on your life. Let's have another drink." They sat and talked. They both grew a little drunk. Presently, Hutchinson told Izzard that he lived with a Malay girl and had a couple of children by her. He had told them to keep out of sight while Campion was there. "I expect she's asleep now," said Hutchinson, with a glance at the door which Izzard knew led into his room, "but I'd like you to see the kiddies in the morning." Just then, a faint wail was heard, and Hutchinson, with a "Hello, the little devil's awake," went to the door and opened it. In a moment or two, he came out of the room with a child in his arms. A woman followed him. "He's cutting his teeth," said Hutchinson. "It makes him restless." The woman wore a sarong and a thin white jacket, and she was barefoot. She was young, with fine dark eyes, and she gave Izzard, when he spoke to her, a bright and pleasant smile. She sat down and lit a cigarette. She answered the civil questions Izzard put to her without embarrassment, but also without effusion. Hutchinson asked her if she would have a whiskey and soda, but she refused. When the 2 men began to talk again in English, she sat on quite quietly, faintly rocking herself in her chair, and occupied with none could tell what calm thoughts. "She's a very good girl," said Hutchinson. "She looks after the house and she's no trouble. Of course, it's the only thing to do in a place like this." "I shall never do it myself," said Izzard. "After all, one may want to get married, and then it means all sorts of botherations." "But who wants to get married? What a life for a white woman! I wouldn't ask a white woman to live here for anything in the world." "Of course, it's a matter of taste. If I have any kiddies, I'm going to see that they have a white mother." Hutchinson looked down at the little dark-skinned child he held in his arms. He gave a faint smile. "It's funny how you get to like them," he said. "When they're your own, it doesn't seem to matter that they've got a touch of the tar brush." The woman gave the child a look, and getting up said she would take it back to bed. "I should think we'd better all turn in," said Hutchinson. "God knows what the time is." Izzard went to his room and threw open the shutters which his boy Hassan, whom he was traveling with, had closed. Blowing out the candle so that it should not attract the mosquitoes, he sat down at the window and looked at the soft night. The whiskey he had drunk made him feel very wide awake, and he was not inclined to go to bed. He took off his ducks, put on a sarong, and lit a cheroot. His good humor was gone. It was the sight of Hutchinson looking fondly at the half-caste child which had upset him. "They've got no right to have them," he said to himself. "They've got no chance in the world. Ever." He passed his hands reflectively along his bare and hairy legs. He shuddered a little. Though he had done everything he could to develop the calves, his legs were like broomsticks. He hated them. He was uneasily conscious of them all the time. They were like a native's. Of course, they were the very legs for a top boot. In his uniform, he had looked very well. He was a tall, powerful man, over 6 feet high, and he had a neat black mustache and neat black hair. His dark eyes were fine and mobile. He was a good-looking fellow, and he knew it, and he dressed well, shabbily when shabbiness was good form, and smartly when the occasion demanded. He had loved the army, and it was a bitter blow to him when, at the end of the war, he could not remain in it. His ambitions were simple. He wanted to have 2,000 a year, give smart little dinners, go to parties, and wear a uniform. He hankered after London. Of course, his mother lived there, and his mother cramped his style. He wondered how on earth he could produce her if ever he got engaged to the girl of good family, with a little money, whom he was looking for to make his wife. Because his father had been dead so long, and during the later part of his career was stationed in the most remote of the Malay states, Izzat felt fairly sure that no one in Sembulu knew anything about her. But he lived in terror lest someone running across her in London should write over to tell people that she was a half-caste. She had been a beautiful creature when Izzat's father, an engineer in the government service, had married her. But now she was a fat old woman with grey hair who sat about all day smoking cigarettes. Izzat was 12 years old when his father died, and then he could speak Malay much more fluently than English. An aunt offered to pay for his education, and Mrs. Izzat accompanied her son to England. She lived habitually in furnished apartments, and her rooms with their oriental draperies and Malay silver were overheated and stuffy. She was forever in trouble with her landladies because she would leave cigarette ends about. Izzat hated the way she made friends with them. She would be shockingly familiar with them for a time. Then there would be a falling out. And after a violent scene, she would flounce out of the house. Her only amusement was the pictures, and to these she went every day in the week. At home, she wore an old and tawdry dressing gown, but when she went out, she dressed herself, but oh, how untidily in extravagant colors, so that it was a mortification to her dapper son. He quarreled with her frequently, she made him impatient, and he was ashamed of her, and yet he felt for her a deep tenderness. It was almost a physical bond between them, something stronger than the ordinary feeling of mother and son, so that notwithstanding the failings that exasperated him, she was the only person in the world with whom he felt entirely at home. It was owing to his father's position and his own knowledge of Malay, for his mother always spoke it to him, that after the war, finding himself with nothing to do, he had managed to enter the service of the Sultan of Sembulu. He had been a success. He played games well, he was strong and a good athlete. In the rest house at Kuala Selor were the cups which he had won at Harrow for running and jumping, and to these he had added since others for golf and tennis. With his abundant fund of small talk, he was an asset at parties, and his cheeriness made things go. He ought to have been happy, and he was wretched. He wanted so much to be popular, and he had an impression, stronger than ever at this moment, that popularity escaped him. He wondered whether by any chance the men at Kuala Selor, with whom he was so hail fellow well met, suspected that he had native blood in him. He knew very well what to expect if they ever found out. They wouldn't say he was gay and friendly then, they would say he was damned familiar. And they would say he was inefficient and careless, as the half-castes were, and when he talked of marrying a white woman, they would snigger. Oh, it was so unfair. What difference could it make, that drop of native blood in his veins? And yet because of it, they would always be on the watch for the expected failure at the critical moment. Everyone knew that you couldn't rely on Eurasians. Sooner or later, they would let you down. He knew it too, but now he asked himself whether they didn't fail because they were so unfair. because failure was expected of them. They were never given a chance, poor devils, but a cock crew loudly. It must be very late, and he was beginning to feel chilly. He got into bed. When Hassan brought him his tea next morning, he had a racking headache, and when he went into breakfast, he could not look at the porridge and the bacon and eggs which were set before him. Hutchinson, too, was feeling none too well. "I fancy we made rather a night of it," said his host, with a smile to conceal his faint embarrassment. "I feel like hell," said Izzard. "I'm going to breakfast off a whiskey and soda myself," added Hutchinson. Izzard asked for nothing better, and it was with distaste that they watched Campion eat with healthy appetite a substantial meal. Campion chaffed them. "By God, Izzard, you're looking green about the gills," he said. "I never saw such a filthy color." Izzard flushed. His swarthiness was always a sensitive point with him, but he forced himself to give a cheery laugh. "You see, I had a Spanish grandmother," he answered, "and when I'm under the weather, it always come out. I remember at Harrow, I fought a boy and licked him because he called me a damned half-caste." "You are dark," said Hutchinson. "Do Malays ever ask you if you have any native blood in you?" "Yes, damn their impudence." A boat with their kit had started early in the morning in order to get to the mouth of the river before them and tell the skipper of the Sultan Ahmed, if by chance he arrived before he was due, that they were on their way. Campion and Izzard were to set out immediately after tiffin in order to arrive at the place where they were to spend the night before the bore passed. A bore is a tidal wave that, by reason of a peculiarity in the lie of the land, surges up certain rivers, and there happened to be one on the river on which they were traveling. Hutchinson had talked to them of it the night before, and Campion, who had never seen such a thing, was much interested. "This is one of the best in Borneo. It's worth looking at," said Hutchinson. He told them how the natives, waiting the moment, rode it and were borne up the river on its crest at a breathless and terrifying speed. He had done it once himself. "Never no more for me," he said. "I was scared out of my wits." "I should like to try it once," said Izzard. "It's exciting enough, but my word, when you're in a flimsy dugout and you know that if the native doesn't get the right moment, you'll be flung in that seething torrent and you won't have a chance in a million. No, it's not my idea of sport." "I've shot a good many rapids in my day," said Campion. "Rapids be damned. You wait till you see the bore. It's one of the most terrifying things I know. Do you know that at least a dozen natives are drowned in it, in this river alone, every year?" They lounged about on the veranda most of the morning, and Hutchinson showed them the courthouse. Then gin pahits were served. They drank 2 or 3. Izzard began to feel himself, and when at length tiffin was ready, he found that he had an excellent appetite. Hutchinson had boasted of his Malay curry, and when the steaming, succulent dishes were placed before them, they all set to ravenously. Hutchinson pressed them to drink. "You've got nothing to do but sleep. Why shouldn't you get drunk?" He could not bear to let them go so soon. It was good after so long to have white men to talk to, and he lingered over the meal. He urged them to eat. They would have a filthy meal that night at the Longhouse, and nothing to drink but arak. They had better make hay while the sun shone. Campion suggested once or twice that they should start, but Hutchinson, and Izzard too, for now he was feeling very happy and comfortable, assured him there was plenty of time. Hutchinson sent for his precious bottle of Benedictine. They had made a hole in it last night. They might as well finish it before they went. When at last he walked down with them to the river, they were all very merry, and none of them was quite steady on his legs. Over the middle of the boat was an atap awning, and under this, Hutchinson had had a mattress laid. The crew were prisoners who had been marched down from the jail to row the white men, and they wore dingy sarongs with the prison mark. They waited at their oars. Izzard and Campion shook hands with Hutchinson and threw themselves down on the mattress. The boat pushed off. The turbid river, wide and placid, glistened in the heat of that brilliant afternoon like polished brass. In the distance ahead of them, they could see the bank with its tangle of green trees. They felt drowsy, but Izzard at least found a curious enjoyment in resisting for a little while the heaviness that was creeping over him, and he made up his mind that he would not let himself fall asleep till he had finished his cheroot. At last, the stub began to burn his fingers, and he flung it into the river. "I'm going to have a wonderful snooze," he said. "What about the boar?" asked Campion. "Oh, that's all right. We needn't worry about that." He gave a long and noisy yawn. His limbs felt like lead. He had one moment in which he was conscious of his delicious drowsiness, and then he knew nothing more. Suddenly, he was awakened by Campion shaking him. "I say, what's that?" "What's what?" He spoke irritably, for sleep was still heavy upon him, but with his eyes he followed Campion's gesture. He could hear nothing, but a good way off he saw 2 or 3 white-crested waves following one another. They did not look very alarming. "Oh, I suppose that's the boar." "What are we going to do about it?" cried Campion. Izzard was scarcely yet quite awake. He smiled at the concern in Campion's voice. "Don't worry, these fellows know all about it. They know exactly what to do. We may get a bit splashed." But while they were saying these few words, the boar came nearer, very quickly, with a roar like the roar of an angry sea, and Izzard saw that the waves were much higher than he had thought. He did not like the look of them, and he tightened his belt so that his shorts should not slip down if the boat were upset. In a moment, the waves were upon them. It was a great wall of water that seemed to tower over them, and it might have been 10 or 12 feet high, but you could measure it only with your horror. It was quite plain that no boat could weather it. The first wave dashed over them, drenching them all, half filling the boat with water, and then immediately another wave struck them. The boatmen began to shout. They pulled madly at their oars, and the steersman yelled an order. But in that surging torrent, they were helpless, and it was frightening to see how soon they lost all control of the boat. The force of the water turned it broadside on, and it was carried along, helter-skelter, upon the crest of the bore. Another great wave dashed over them, and the boat began to sink. Izzard and Campion scrambled out of the covered place in which they had been lying, and suddenly the boat gave way under their feet, and they found themselves struggling in the water. It surged and stormed around them. Izzard's first impulse was to swim for the shore, but his boy, Hassan, shouted to him to cling to the boat. For a minute or two, they all did this. "Are you all right?" Campion shouted to him. "Yes, enjoying the bath," said Izzard. He imagined that the waves would pass by as the boar ascended the river, and in a few minutes at the outside, they would find themselves in calm water once more. He forgot that they were being carried along on its crest. The waves dashed over them. They clung to the gunwale and the base of the structure which supported the atap awning. Then a larger wave caught the boat, and it turned over, falling upon them so that they lost their hold. There seemed nothing but a slippery bottom to cling to, and Izzard's hands slithered helplessly on the greasy surface. But the boat continued to turn, and he made a desperate grab at the gunwale, only to feel it slip out of his hands as the turn went on. Then he caught the framework of the awning, and still it turned slowly right round, and once more he sought for a handhold on the bottom. The boat went round and round with a horrible regularity. He thought this must be because everyone was clinging to one side of it, and he tried to make the crew go round to the other. He could not make them understand. Everyone was shouting, and the waves beat against them with a dull and angry roar. Each time the boat rolled over on them, Izzard was pushed under water, only to come up again as the gunwale and the framework of the awning gave him something to cling to. The struggle was awful. Presently, he began to get terribly out of breath, and he felt his strength leaving him. He knew that he could not hold on much longer, but he did not feel frightened, for his fatigue by now was so great that he did not very much care what happened. Hassan was by his side, and he told him he was growing very tired. He thought the best thing was to make a dash for the shore. It did not look more than 60 yards away, but Hassan begged him not to. Still, they were being carried along amid those seething, pounding waves. The boat went round and round, and they scrambled over it like squirrels in a cage. Izzat swallowed a lot of water. He felt he was very nearly done. Hassan could not help him, but it was a comfort that he was there, for Izzat knew that his boy, used to the water all his life, was a powerful swimmer. Then, Izzat did not know why. For a minute or two, the boat held bottom downwards, so that he was able to hold on to the gunwale. It was a precious thing to be able to get his breath. At that moment, 2 dugouts with Malays in them riding the boar passed swiftly by them. They shouted for help, but the Malays averted their faces and went on. They saw the white men and did not want to be concerned in any trouble that might befall them. It was agonizing to see them go past, callous and indifferent in their safety. But on a sudden, the boat rolled round again, round and round, slowly, and the miserable, exhausting scramble repeated itself. It took the heart out of you. But the short respite had helped Izzat, and he was able to struggle a little longer. Then once more he found himself so terribly out of breath that he thought his chest would burst. His strength was all gone, and he did not know now whether he had enough to try to swim for the shore. Suddenly he heard a cry. "Izzat! Izzat! Help! Help!" It was Campion's voice. It was a scream of agony. It sent a shock all through Izzat's nerves. Campion! Campion! What did he care for Campion? Fear seized him, a blind animal fear, and it gave him a new strength. He did not answer. "Help me, quick, quick," he said to Hassan. Hassan understood him at once. By a miracle, one of the oars was floating quite close to them, and he pushed it into Izzat's reach. He placed a hand under Izzat's arm, and they struck away from the boat. Izzat's heart was pounding, and his breath came with difficulty. He felt horribly weak. The waves beat in his face. The bank looked dreadfully far away. He did not think he could ever reach it. Suddenly the boy cried that he could touch bottom, and Izzat put down his legs, but he could feel nothing. He swam a few more exhausted strokes, his eyes fixed on the bank, and then, trying again, felt his feet sink into thick mud. He was thankful. He floundered on, and there was the bank within reach of his hands, black mud in which he sank to his knees. He scrambled up, desperate to get out of the cruel water, and when he came to the top, he found a little flat with tall, rank grass all about it. He and Hassan sank down on it and lay for a while stretched out like dead men. They were so tired that they could not move. They were covered with black mud from head to foot. But presently, Izzat's mind began to work, and a pang of anguish on a sudden shook him. Campion was drowned. It was awful. He did not know how he was going to explain the disaster when he got back to Kuala Salor. They would blame him for it. He ought to have remembered the boar and told the steersman to make for the bank and tie up the boat when he saw it coming. It wasn't his fault, it was the steersman's. He knew the river. Why in God's name hadn't he had the sense to get into safety? How could he have expected that it was possible to ride that horrible torrent? Izzat's limbs shook as he remembered the wall of seething water that rushed down upon them. He must get the body and take it back to Kuala Salor. He wondered whether any of the crew were drowned too. He felt too weak to move, but Hassan now rose and wrung the water out of his sarong. He looked over the river and quickly turned to Izzat. "Tuan, A boat is coming. The long grass prevented Izzard from seeing anything. Shout to them, he said. Hassan slipped out of view and made his way along the branch of a tree that overhung the water. He cried out and waved. Presently, Izzard heard voices. There was a rapid conversation between the boy and the occupants of the boat, and then the boy came back. They saw us capsize, Tuan, he said, and they came as soon as the boar passed. There's a long house on the other side. If you will cross the river, they will give us sarongs and food, and we can sleep there. Izzard for a moment felt that he could not again trust himself on the face of the treacherous water. What about the other Tuan? He asked. They do not know. If he's drowned, they must find the body. Another boat has gone upstream. Izzard did not know what to do. He was numb. Hassan put his arm round his shoulder and raised him to his feet. He made his way through the thick grass to the edge of the water, and there he saw a dugout with 2 dyaks in it. The river now once more was calm and sluggish. The great wave had passed on, and no one would have dreamed that so short a while before the placid surface was like a stormy sea. The dyaks repeated to him what they had already told the boy. Izzard could not bring himself to speak. He felt that if he said a word, he would burst out crying. Hassan helped him to get in, and the dyaks began to pull across. He fearfully wanted something to smoke, but his cigarettes and his matches, both in a hip pocket, were soaking. The passage of the river seemed endless. The night fell, and when they reached the bank, the first stars were shining. He stepped ashore, and one of the dyaks took him up to the longhouse. But Hassan seized the paddle he had dropped, and with the other pushed out into the stream. 2 or 3 men and some children came down to meet Izzard, and he climbed to the house amid a babel of conversation. He went up the ladder and was led with greetings and excited comment to the space where the young men slept. Rattan mats were hurriedly laid to make him a couch, and he sank down on them. Someone brought him a jar of arak, and he took a long drink. It was rough and fiery, burning his throat, but it warmed his heart. He slipped off his shirt and trousers and put on a dry sarong which someone lent him. By chance he caught sight of the yellow new moon lying on her back, and it gave him a keen, almost a sensual pleasure. He could not help thinking that he might at that moment be a corpse floating up the river with the tide. The moon had never looked to him more lovely. He began to feel hungry, and he asked for rice. One of the women went into a room to prepare it. He was more himself now, and he began to think again of the explanations he would make at Kuala Solo. No one could really blame him because he had gone to sleep. He certainly wasn't drunk. Hutchinson would bear him out there, and how was he to suspect that the steersman would be such a damned fool? It was just rotten luck. But he couldn't think of Campion without a shudder. At last, a platter of rice was brought him, and he was just about to start eating when a man ran hurriedly along and came up to him. "The Tuan's come!" he cried. "What Tuan?" He jumped up. There was a commotion about the doorway, and he stepped forward. Hassan was coming quickly towards him out of the darkness, and then he heard a voice. "Izzard, are you there?" Campion advanced towards him. "Well, here we are again. By God, that was a pretty near thing, wasn't it? You seem to have made yourself nice and comfortable. My heavens, I could do with a drink." His dank clothes clung round him, and he was muddy and disheveled. But he was in excellent spirits. I didn't know where the hell they were bringing me. I'd made up my mind that I should have to spend the night on the bank. I thought you were drowned. "Here's some arak," said Izzard. Campion put his mouth to the jar and drank and spluttered and drank again. "Muck, but by God, it's strong." He looked at Izzard with a grin of his broken and discolored teeth. "I say, old man, you look as though you'd be all the better for a wash. I'll wash later." "All right, so will I. Tell them to get me a sarong." How did you get out? He did not wait for an answer. I thought I was done for. I owe my life to these two sportsmen here. He indicated with a cheery nod two of the Dyak prisoners whom Izzard vaguely recognized as having been part of their crew. They were hanging onto that blasted boat on each side of me, and somehow they cottoned onto it that I was down and out. I couldn't have lasted another minute. They made signs to me that we could risk having a shot at getting to the bank, but I didn't think I had the strength. By George, I've never been so blown in all my life. I don't know how they managed it, but somehow they got hold of the mattress we'd been lying on, and they made it into a roll. They're sportsmen, they are. I don't know why they didn't just save themselves without bothering about me. They gave it to me. I thought it a damned poor lifebelt, but I saw the force of the proverb about a drowning man clutching at a straw. I caught hold of the damn thing, and between them, somehow or other, they dragged me ashore. The danger from which he had escaped made Campion excited and voluble, but Izzard hardly listened to what he said. He heard once more, as distinctly as though the words rang now through the air, Campion's agonized cry for help, and he felt sick with terror. The blind panic raced down his nerves. Campion was talking still, but was he talking to conceal his thoughts? Izzard looked into those bright blue eyes and sought to read the sense behind the flow of words. Was there a hard glint in them, or something of cynical mockery? Did he know that Izzard, leaving him to his fate, had cut and run? He flushed deeply. After all, what was there that he could have done? At such a moment it was each for himself, and the devil take the hindmost. But what would they say in Kuala Sola if Campion told them that Izzard had deserted him? He ought to have stayed. He wished now with all his heart that he had. But then it was stronger than himself. He couldn't. Could anyone blame him? No one who had seen that fierce and seething torrent. Oh, the water and the exhaustion, so that he could have cried. If you're as hungry as I am, you'd better have a tuck-in at this rice, he said. Campion ate voraciously, but when Izzard had taken a mouthful or two, he found that he had no appetite. Campion talked and talked. Izzard listened suspiciously. He felt that he must be alert, and he drank more arak. He began to feel a little drunk. I shall get into the devil of a row at KS, he said tentatively. I don't know why. I was told off to look after you. They won't think it was very clever of me to let you get nearly drowned. It wasn't your fault. It was the fault of the damned fool of a steersman. After all, the important thing is that we're saved. By George, I thought I was finished once. I shouted out to you. I don't know if you heard me. No, I didn't hear anything. There was such a devil of a row, wasn't there? Perhaps you'd got away before. I don't know exactly when you did get away. Izzard looked at him sharply. Was it his fancy that there was an odd look in Campion's eyes? There was such an awful confusion, he said. I was just about down and out. My boy threw me over an oar. He gave me to understand you were all right. He told me you'd got ashore. The oar. He ought to have given Campion the oar and told Hassan, the strong swimmer, to give him his help. Was it his fancy again that Campion gave him a quick and searching glance? I wish I could have been of more use to you, said Izzard. Oh, I'm sure you had enough to do to look after yourself, answered Campion. The headman brought them cups of arak, and they both drank a great deal. Izzard's head began to spin, and he suggested that they should turn in. Beds had been prepared for them, and mosquito nets fixed. They were to set out at dawn on the rest of their journey down the river. Campion's bed was next to his, and in a few minutes he heard him snoring. He had fallen asleep the moment he lay down. The young men of the longhouse and the prisoners of the boat's crew went on talking late into the night. Izzard's head now was aching horribly, and he could not think. When Hassan roused him, as day broke, it seemed to him that he had not slept at all. Their clothes had been washed and dried. but they were bedraggled objects as they walked along the narrow pathway to the river where the prahu was waiting for them. They rowed leisurely. The morning was lovely, and the great stretch of placid water gleamed in the early light. "By George, it's fine to be alive," said Campion. He was grubby and unshaved. He took long breaths, and his twisted mouth was half open with a grin. You could tell that he found the air singularly good to breathe. He was delighted with the blue sky and the sunshine and the greenness of the trees. Izzard hated him. He was sure that this morning there was a difference in his manner. He did not know what to do. He had a mind to throw himself on his mercy. He had behaved like a cad, but he was sorry. He would give anything to have the chance again, but anyone might have done what he did, and if Campion gave him away, he was ruined. He could never stay in Sembulu. His name would be mud in Borneo and the Straits settlements. If he made his confession to Campion, he could surely get Campion to promise to hold his tongue. But would he keep his promise? He looked at him, a shifty little man. How could he be relied on? Izzard thought of what he had said the night before. It wasn't the truth, of course, but who could know that? At all events, who could prove that he hadn't honestly thought that Campion was safe? Whatever Campion said, it was only his word against Izzard's. He could laugh and shrug his shoulders and say that Campion had lost his head and didn't know what he was talking about. Besides, it wasn't certain that Campion hadn't accepted his story. In that frightful struggle for life, he could be very sure of nothing. He had a temptation to go back to the subject, but was afraid if he did, that he would excite suspicion in Campion's mind. He must hold his tongue. That was his only chance of safety, and when they got to KS, he would get in his story first. "I should be completely happy now," said Campion, "if I only had something to smoke. We shall be able to get some stinkers on board." Campion gave a little laugh. "Human beings are very unreasonable," he said. "At the first moment I was so glad to be alive that I thought of nothing else. But now I'm beginning to regret the loss of my notes and my photographs and my shaving tackle." Izzard formulated the thought which had lurked at the back of his mind, but which all through the night he had refused to admit into his consciousness. "I wish to God he'd been drowned. Then I'd have been safe." "There she is," cried Campion suddenly. Izzard looked round. They were at the mouth of the river, and there was the Sultan Ahmed waiting for them. Izzard's heart sank. He had forgotten that she had an English skipper and that he would have to be told the story of their adventure. What would Campion say? The skipper was called Breddon, and Izzard had met him often at Kuala Solor. He was a little bluff man with a black moustache and a breezy manner. "Hurry up," he called out to them as they rowed up. "I've been waiting for you since dawn." But when they climbed on board, his face fell. "Hello, what's the matter with you?" "Give us a drink and you shall hear all about it," said Campion with his crooked grin. "Come along." They sat down under the awning. On a table were glasses, a bottle of whiskey and soda water. The skipper gave an order, and in a few minutes they were noisily underway. "We were caught in the bore," said Izzard. He felt he must say something. His mouth was horribly dry, notwithstanding the drink. "Were you, by Jove? You're lucky not to have been drowned. What happened?" He addressed himself to Izzard because he knew him, but it was Campion who answered. He related the whole incident accurately, and Izzard listened with strained attention. Campion spoke in the plural when he told the early part of the story, and then, as he came to the moment when they were thrown into the water, changed to the singular. At first it was what they had done, and now it was what happened to him. He left Izzard out of it. Izzard did not know whether to be relieved or alarmed. Why did he not mention him? Was it because, in that mortal struggle for life, he had thought of nothing but himself? Or did he know? "And what happened to you?" said Captain Breddon, turning to Izzard. Izzard was about to answer when Campion spoke. Until I got over to the other side of the river, I thought he was drowned. I don't know how he got out. I expect he hardly knows himself." "It was touch and go," said Izzard with a laugh. Why had Campion said that? He caught his eye. He was sure now that there was a gleam of amusement in it. It was awful not to be certain. He was frightened. He was ashamed. He wondered if he could not so guide the conversation, either now or later, as to ask Campion whether that was the story he was going to tell in Qualis Allure. There was nothing in it to excite anyone's suspicions. But if nobody else knew, Campion knew. He could have killed him. "Well, I think you're both of you damn lucky to be alive," said the skipper. It was but a short run to Kuala Sola, and as they steamed up the Sembulu River, Izzard moodily watched the banks. On each side were the mangroves and the nippahs washed by the water, and behind, the dense green of the jungle. Here and there, among fruit trees, were Malay houses on piles. Night fell as they docked. Goring, of the police, came on board and shook hands with them. He was living at the rest house just then, and as he set about his work of seeing the native passengers, he told them they would find another man, Porter by name, staying there too. They would all meet at dinner. The boys took charge of their kit, and Campion and Izzard strolled along. They bathed and changed, and at 8:30, the four of them assembled in the common room for gin pints. "I say, what's this Breton tells me about your being nearly drowned?" said Goring as he came in. Izzard felt himself flush, but before he could answer, Campion broke in, and it seemed certain to Izzard that he spoke in order to give the story as he chose. He felt hot with shame. Not a word was spoken in disparagement of him, not a word was said of him at all. He wondered if those two men who listened, Goring and Porter, thought it strange that he should be left out. He looked at Campion intently as he proceeded with his narration. He told it rather humorously. He did not disguise the danger in which they had been, but he made a joke of it, so that the two listeners laughed at the quandary in which they found themselves. "A thing that's tickled me since," said Campion, "is that when I got over to the other bank, I was black with mud from head to foot. I felt I really ought to jump in the river and have a wash. But you know, I felt I'd been in that damned river as much as ever I wanted, and I said to myself, no, by George, I'll go dirty. And when I got into the longhouse and saw Izzard as black as I was, I knew he'd felt just like I did." They laughed, and Izzard forced himself to laugh too. He noticed that Campion had told the story in precisely the same words as he had used when he told it to the skipper of the Sultan Ahmed. There could be only one explanation of that. He knew everything, and had made up his mind exactly what story to tell. The ingenuity with which Campion gave the facts, and yet left out what must be to Izzard's discredit, was devilish. But why was he holding his hand? It wasn't in him not to feel contempt and resentment for the man who had callously deserted him in that moment of dreadful peril. Suddenly, in a flash of inspiration, Izzard understood. He was keeping the truth to tell to Willis, the resident. Izzard had goose flesh as he thought of confronting Willis. He could deny, but would his denials serve him? Willis was no fool, and he would get at Hassan. Hassan could not be trusted to be silent. Hassan would give him away. Then he would be done for. Willis would suggest that he had better go home. He had a racking headache, and after dinner he went to his room, for he wanted to be alone, so that he could devise a plan of action. And then a thought came to him which made him go hot and cold. He knew that the secret which he had guarded so long was a secret to nobody. He was on a sudden certain of it. Why should he have those bright eyes and that swarthy skin? Why should he speak Malay with such ease and have learned Dayak so quickly? Of course they knew. What a fool he was ever to think that they believed that story of his about the Spanish grandmother. They must have laughed up their sleeves when he told it, and behind his back they had called him a damned nigger. And now another thought came to him, torturing, and he asked himself whether it was on account of that wretched drop of native blood in him that when he heard Campion cry out, his nerve failed him. After all, anyone might at that moment have been seized with panic. And why in God's name should he sacrifice his life to save a man's whom he cared nothing for? It was insane. But of course in KS, they would say it was only what they expected. They would make no allowances. At last he went to bed, but when, after tossing about recklessly for God knows how long, he fell asleep, he was awakened by a fearful dream. He seemed to be once more in that raging torrent, with the boat turning, and then there was the desperate clutching at the gunwale and the agony as it slipped out of his hands, and the water that roared over him. He was wide awake before dawn. His only chance was to see Willis and get his story in first, and he thought over carefully what he was going to say, and chose the very words he meant to use. He got up early, and in order not to see Campion, went out without breakfast. He walked along the high road till such time as he knew the resident would be in his office, and then walked back again. He sent in his name and was ushered into Willis's room. He was a little elderly man with thin grey hair and a long yellow face. "I'm glad to see you back safe and sound," he said, shaking hands with Izzard. "What's this I hear about your being nearly drowned?" Izzard, in clean ducks, his topies spotless, was a fine figure of a man. His black hair was neatly brushed and his moustache was trimmed. He had an upright and soldierly bearing. "I thought I'd better come and tell you at once, sir, as you told me to look after Campion." "Fire away." Izzard told his story. He made light of the danger. He gave Willis to understand that it had not been very great. They would never have been upset if they had not started so late. "I tried to get Campion away earlier, but he'd had 2 or 3 drinks, and the fact is, he didn't want to move." "Was he tight?" "I don't know about that," smiled Izzard good-humoredly. "I shouldn't say he was cold sober." He went on with his story. He managed to insinuate that Campion had lost his head a little. Of course, it was a very frightening business to a man who wasn't a decent swimmer. He, Izzard, had been more concerned for Campion than for himself. He knew the only chance was to keep cool, and the moment they were upset, he saw that Campion had got the wind up. "You can't blame him for that," said the resident. "Of course I did everything I possibly could for him, sir, but the fact is, there wasn't anything much I could do." "Well, the great thing is that you both escaped. It would have been very awkward for all of us if he'd been drowned." "I thought I'd better come and tell you the facts before you saw Campion, sir. I fancy he's inclined to talk rather wildly about it. There's no use exaggerating." "On the whole, your stories agree pretty well," said Willis with a little smile. Izzard looked at him blankly. "Haven't you seen Campion this morning?" "I heard from Goring that there'd been some trouble, and I looked in last night on my way home from the fort after dinner." "You'd already gone to bed." Izzard felt himself trembling, and he made a great effort to preserve his composure. "By the way, you got away first, didn't you?" "I don't really know, sir. You see, there was a lot of confusion. You must have if you got over to the other side before he did." "I suppose I did then." "Well, thanks for coming to tell me," said Willis, rising from his chair. As he did so, he knocked some books on the floor. They fell with a sudden thud. The unexpected sound made Izzard start violently, and he gave a gasp. The resident looked at him quickly. "I say, your nerves are in a pretty state." Izzard could not control his trembling. "I'm very sorry, sir," he murmured. "I expect it's been a shock. You'd better take it easy for a few days. Why don't you get the doctor to give you something?" "I didn't sleep very well last night." The resident nodded as though he understood. Izzard left the room, and as he passed out, some man he knew stopped and congratulated him on his escape. They all knew of it. He walked back to the rest house. and as he walked, he repeated to himself the story he had told the resident. Was it really the same story that Campion had told? He had never suspected that the resident had already heard it from Campion. What a fool he had been to go to bed. He should never have let Campion out of his sight. Why had the resident listened without telling him that he already knew? Now Izzard cursed himself for having suggested that Campion was drunk and had lost his head. He had said this in order to discredit him, but he knew now that it was a stupid thing to do. And why had Willis said that about his having got away first? Perhaps he was holding his hand too. Perhaps he was going to make inquiries. Willis was very shrewd. But what exactly had Campion said? He must know that. At whatever cost, he must know. Izzard's mind was seething, so that he felt he could hardly keep a hold on his thoughts, but he must keep calm. He felt like a hunted animal. He did not believe that Willis liked him. Once or twice in the office, he had blamed him because he was careless. Perhaps he was just waiting till he got all the facts. Izzard was almost hysterical. He entered the rest house, and there, sitting on a long chair with his legs stretched out, was Campion. He was reading the papers which had arrived during their absence in the jungle. Izzard felt a blind rush of hatred well up in him as he looked at the little shabby man who held him in the hollow of his hand. "Hello," said Campion, looking up. "Where have you been?" To Izzard, it seemed that there was in his eyes a mocking irony. He clenched his hands, and his breath came fast. "What have you been saying to Willis about me?" he asked abruptly. The tone in which he put the unexpected question was so harsh that Campion gave him a glance of faint surprise. I don't think I've been saying anything very much about you." "Why?" "He came here last night." Izzard looked at him intently. His brows were drawn together in an angry frown as he tried to read Campion's thoughts. "I told him you'd gone to bed with a headache. He wanted to know about our mishap." "I've just seen him." Izzard walked up and down the large and shaded room. Now, though it was still early, the sun was hot and dazzling. He felt himself in a net. He was blind with rage. He could have seized Campion by the throat and strangled him. And yet, because he did not know what he had to fight against, he felt himself powerless. He was tired and ill, and his nerves were shaken. On a sudden, the anger which had given him a sort of strength left him, and he was filled with despondency. It was as though water and not blood ran through his veins. His heart sank, and his knees seemed to give way. He felt that if he did not take care, he would begin to cry. He was dreadfully sorry for himself. "Damn you! I wish to God I'd never set eyes on you," he cried pitifully. "What on earth's the matter?" asked Campion with astonishment. "Oh, don't pretend. We've been pretending for 2 days, and I'm fed up with it." His voice rose shrilly. It sounded odd in that robust and powerful man. "I'm fed up with it. I cut and run. I left you to drown. I know I behaved like a skunk. I couldn't help it." Campion rose slowly from his chair. "What are you talking about?" His tone was so genuinely surprised that it gave Izzard a start. A cold shiver ran down his spine. "When you called for help, I was panic-stricken. I just caught hold of an oar and got Hassan to help me get away." "That was the most sensible thing you could do." "I couldn't help you. There wasn't a thing I could do." "Of course not. It was damned silly of me to shout. It was waste of breath, and breath was the very thing I wanted." "Do you mean to say you didn't know? When those fellows got me the mattress, I thought you were still clinging to the boat. I had an idea that I got away before you did." Izzard put both his hands to his head and gave a hoarse cry of despair. "My God, what a fool I've been." The two men stood for a while staring at one another. The silence seemed endless. "What are you going to do now?" asked Izzard at last. Oh, my dear fellow, don't worry. I've been frightened too often myself to blame anyone who shows the white feather. I'm not going to tell a soul. Yes, but you know. I promise you, you can trust me. Besides, my job's done here and I'm going home. I want to catch the next boat to Singapore. There was a pause, and Campion looked for a while reflectively at his art. There's only one thing I'd like to ask you. I've made a good many friends here, and there are one or two things I'm a little sensitive about. When you tell the story of our upset, I should be grateful if you wouldn't make out that I had behaved badly. I wouldn't like the fellows here to think that I'd lost my nerve. His art flushed darkly. He remembered what he had said to the resident. It almost looked as though Campion had been listening over his shoulder. He cleared his throat. I don't know why you think I should do that. Campion chuckled good-naturedly, and his blue eyes were gay with amusement. The yellow streak, he replied, and then, with a grin that showed his broken and discolored teeth, have a cheroot, dear boy. The Greek. A short story by Somerset Maugham. Ashenden arrived in Naples, and having taken a room at the hotel, wrote its number on a sheet of paper in block letters and posted it to the hairless Mexican. He went to the British consulate, where R had arranged to send any instructions he might have for him, and found that they knew about him, and everything was in order. Then he put aside these matters and made up his mind to amuse himself. Here in the south, the spring was well advanced, and in the busy streets the sun was hot. Ashenden knew Naples pretty well. The Piazza di San Ferdinando, with its bustle, the Piazza del Plebiscito, with its handsome church, stirred in his heart pleasant recollections. The Strada di Chiaia was as noisy as ever. He stood at corners and looked up the narrow alleys that climbed the hill precipitously, those alleys of high houses with the washing set out to dry on lines across the street like pennants flying to mark a feast day. And he sauntered along the shore, looking at the burnished sea with Capri faintly outlined against the day, till he came to Posillipo, where there was an old, rambling and bedraggled palazzo in which in his youth he had spent many a romantic hour. He observed the curious little pain with which the memories of the past wrung his heartstrings. Then he took a fly, drawn by a small and scraggy pony, and rattled back over the stones to the Galleria, where he sat in the cool and drank an Americano, and looked at the people who loitered there, talking, forever talking, with vivacious gestures, and, exercising his fancy, sought from their appearance to divine their reality. For 3 days, Ashenden led the idle life that fitted so well the fantastical, untidy, and genial city. He did nothing from morning till night, but wander at random, looking not with the eye of the tourist who seeks for what ought to be seen, nor with the eye of the writer who looks for his own, seeing in a sunset a melodious phrase or in a face the inkling of a character, but with that of the tramp, to whom whatever happens is absolute. He went to the museum to look at the statue of Agrippina the Younger, which he had particular reasons for remembering with affection, and took the opportunity to see once more the Titian and the Bruegel in the picture gallery. But he always came back to the church of Santa Chiara. Its grace, its gaiety, the airy persiflage with which it seemed to treat religion, and at the back of this, its sensual emotion, its extravagance, its elegance of line. To Ashenden, it seemed to express, as it were in one absurd and grandiloquent metaphor, the sunny, dusty, lovely city and its bustling inhabitants. It said that life was charming and sad. It's a pity one hadn't any money, but money wasn't everything. And anyway, why bother when we are here today and gone tomorrow? And it was all very exciting and amusing. And after all, we must make the best of things. Facciamo una piccola combinazione. But on the fourth morning, when Ashenden, having just stepped out of his bath, was trying to dry himself on a towel that absorbed no moisture, his door was quickly opened and a man slipped into his room. "What do you want?" cried Ashenden. "It's all right. Don't you know me?" "Good Lord, it's the Mexican. What have you done to yourself?" He had changed his wig and wore now a black one, close-cropped, that fitted on his head like a cap. It entirely altered the look of him, and though this was still odd enough, it was quite different from that which he had worn before. He wore a shabby grey suit. "I can only stop a minute. He's getting shaved." Ashenden felt his cheeks suddenly redden. "You found him then?" "That wasn't difficult. He was the only Greek passenger on the ship. I went on board when she got in and asked for a friend who had sailed from the Piraeus. I said I had come to meet a Mr. George Diogenes. I pretended to be much puzzled at his not coming, and I got into a conversation with Andreadi. He's traveling under a false name. He calls himself Lombardos. I followed him when he landed, and do you know the first thing he did? He went into a barber's and had his beard shaved. What do you think of that?" "Nothing. Anyone might have his beard shaved." "That is not what I think. He wanted to change his appearance. Oh, he's cunning. I admire the Germans. They leave nothing to chance. He's got his whole story pat. But I'll tell you that in a minute. By the way, you've changed your appearance too." "Ah, yes, this is a wig I'm wearing. It makes a difference, doesn't it?" "I should never have known you." "One has to take precautions. We are bosom friends. We had to spend the day in Brindisi, and he cannot speak Italian. He was glad to have me help him, and we traveled up together. I have brought him to this hotel. He says he is going to Rome tomorrow, but I shall not let him out of my sight. I do not want him to give me the slip. He says that he wants to see Naples, and I have offered to show him everything there is to see." "Why isn't he going to Rome today?" "That is part of the story. He pretends he is a Greek businessman who has made money during the war. He says he was the owner of 2 coasting steamers and has just sold them. Now he means to go to Paris and have his fling. He says he has wanted to go to Paris all his life and at last has the chance. He is close. I tried to get him to talk. I told him I was a Spaniard and had been to Brindisi to arrange communications with Turkey about war material. He listened to me, and I saw he was interested, but he told me nothing, and of course I did not think it wise to press him. He has the papers on his person." "How do you know?" "He's not anxious about his grip, but he feels every now and then round his middle. They're either in a belt or in the lining of his vest." "Why the devil did you bring him to this hotel?" "I thought it would be more convenient. We may want to search his luggage." "Are you staying here too?" "No, I'm not such a fool as that. I told him I was going to Rome by the night train and would not take a room. But I must go. I promised to meet him outside the barber's in 15 minutes." "All right. Where shall I find you tonight if I want you?" Ashenden for an instant eyed the hairless Mexican, then, with a slight frown, looked away. "I shall spend the evening in my room." "Very well. Will you just see that there's nobody in the passage?" Ashenden opened the door and looked out. He saw no one. The hotel, in point of fact at that season, was nearly empty. There were few foreigners in Naples, and trade was bad. "It's all right," said Ashenden. The hairless Mexican walked boldly out. Ashenden closed the door behind him. He shaved and slowly dressed. The sun was shining as brightly as usual on the square, and the people who passed, the shabby little carriages with their scrawny horses, had the same air as before, but they did not any longer fill Ashenden with gaiety. He was not comfortable. He went out and called, as was his habit at the consulate, to ask if there was a telegram for him. Nothing. Then he went to Cook's and looked out the trains to Rome. There was one soon after midnight and another at 5 in the morning. He wished he could catch the first. He did not know what were the Mexicans' plans. If he really wanted to get to Cuba, he would do well to make his way to Spain. And glancing at the notices in the office, Ashenden saw that next day there was a ship sailing from Naples to Barcelona. Ashenden was bored with Naples. The glare in the streets tired his eyes, the dust was intolerable, the noise was deafening. He went to the Galleria and had a drink. In the afternoon, he went to a cinema. Then, going back to his hotel, he told the clerk that since he was starting so early in the morning, he preferred to pay his bill at once, and he took his luggage to the station, leaving in his room only a dispatch case in which were the printed part of his code and a book or two. He dined. Then, returning to the hotel, he sat down to wait for the hairless Mexican. He could not conceal from himself the fact that he was exceedingly nervous. He began to read, but the book was tiresome, and he tried another. His attention wandered, and he glanced at his watch. It was desperately early. He took up his book again, making up his mind that he would not look at his watch till he had read 30 pages, but though he ran his eyes conscientiously down one page after another, he could not tell more than vaguely what it was he read. He looked at the time again. Good God, it was only 10:30. He wondered where the hairless Mexican was and what he was doing. He was afraid he would make a mess of things. It was a horrible business. Then it struck him that he had better shut the window and draw his curtains. He smoked innumerable cigarettes. He looked at his watch, and it was 11:15. A thought struck him, and his heart began to beat against his chest. Out of curiosity, he counted his pulse and was surprised to find that it was normal. Though it was a warm night and the room was stuffy, his hands and feet were icy. What a nuisance it was, he reflected irritably, to have an imagination that conjured up pictures of things that you didn't in the least want to see. From his standpoint as a writer, he had often considered murder, and his mind went to that fearful description of one in crime and punishment. He did not want to think of this topic, but it forced itself upon him. His book dropped to his knees, and staring at the wall in front of him, it had a brown wallpaper with a pattern of dingy roses. He asked himself how, if one had to, one would commit a murder in Naples. Of course, there was the villa, the great leafy garden facing the bay in which stood the aquarium. That was deserted at night and very dark. Things happened there that did not bear the light of day, and prudent persons after dusk avoided its sinister paths. Beyond Posillipo, the road was very solitary, and there were byways that led up the hill in which by night you would never meet a soul. But how would you induce a man who had any nerves to go there? You might suggest a row in the bay, but the boatman who hired the boat would see you. It was doubtful indeed if he would let you go on the water alone. There were disreputable hotels down by the harbor where no questions were asked of persons who arrived late at night without luggage. But here again, the waiter who showed you your room had the chance of a good look at you, and you had on entering to sign an elaborate questionnaire. Ashenden looked once more at the time. He was very tired. He sat now not even trying to read, his mind a blank. Then the door opened softly, and he sprang to his feet. His flesh crept. The hairless Mexican stood before him. "Did I startle you?" he asked, smiling. "I thought you would prefer me not to knock." "Did anyone see you come in?" "I was let in by the night watchman. He was asleep when I rang and didn't even look at me. I'm sorry I'm so late, but I had to change." The hairless Mexican wore now the clothes he had traveled down in and his fair wig. It was extraordinary how different he looked. He was bigger and more flamboyant. The very shape of his face was altered. His eyes were shining, and he seemed in excellent spirits. He gave Ashenden a glance. "How white you are, my friend. Surely you're not nervous? Have you got the documents?" No, he hadn't got them on him. This is all he had. He put down on the table a bulky pocketbook and a passport. "I don't want them," said Ashenden quickly. "Take them." With a shrug of the shoulders, the hairless Mexican put the things back in his pocket. "What was in his belt? You said he kept feeling round his middle." "Only money. I've looked through the pocketbook. It contains nothing but private letters and photographs of women. He must have locked the documents in his grip before coming out with me this evening." "Damn," said Ashenden. "I've got the key of his room. We'd better go and look through his luggage." Ashenden felt a sensation of sickness in the pit of his stomach. He hesitated. The Mexican smiled, not unkindly. "There's no risk, amigo," he said, as though he were reassuring a small boy. "But if you don't feel happy, I'll go alone." "No, I'll come with you," said Ashenden. "There's no one awake in the hotel, and Mr. Andreadi won't disturb us. Take off your shoes if you like." Ashenden did not answer. He frowned because he noticed his hands were slightly trembling. He unlaced his shoes and slipped them off. The Mexican did the same. "You'd better go first," he said. "Turn to the left and go straight along the corridor. It's number 38. Ashenden opened the door and stepped out. The passage was dimly lit. It exasperated him to feel so nervous when he could not but be aware that his companion was perfectly at ease. When they reached the door, the hairless Mexican inserted the key, turned the lock, and went in. He switched on the light. Ashenden followed him and closed the door. He noticed that the shutters were shut. "Now we're all right. We can take our time." He took a bunch of keys out of his pocket, tried one or two, and at last hit upon the right one. The suitcase was filled with clothes. "Cheap clothes," said the Mexican contemptuously as he took them out. "My own principle is that it's always cheaper in the end to buy the best. After all, one is a gentleman or one isn't a gentleman." "Are you obliged to talk?" asked Ashenden. "A spice of danger affects people in different ways. TT only excites me, but it puts you in a bad temper, amigo." "You see, I'm scared and you're not," replied Ashenden with candor. "It's merely a matter of nerves." Meanwhile, he felt the clothes, rapidly but with care, as he took them out. There were no papers of any sort in the suitcase. Then he took out his knife and slit the lining. It was a cheap piece, and the lining was gummed to the material of which the suitcase was made. There was no possibility of anything being concealed in it. "They're not here. They must be hidden in the room." "Are you sure he didn't deposit them in some office? At one of the consulates, for example?" "He was never out of my sight for a moment, except when he was getting shaved." The hairless Mexican opened the drawers in the cupboard. There was no carpet on the floor. He looked under the bed, in it, and under the mattress. His dark eyes shot up and down the room, looking for a hiding place, and Ashenden felt that nothing escaped him. Perhaps he left them in charge of the clerk downstairs. I should have known it. And he wouldn't dare. "They're not here. I can't understand it." He looked about the room irresolutely. He frowned in the attempt to guess at a solution of the mystery. "Let's get out of here," said Ashenden. "In a minute." The Mexican went down on his knees, quickly and neatly folded the clothes, and packed them up again. He locked the bag and stood up. Then, putting out the light, he slowly opened the door and looked out. He beckoned to Ashenden and slipped into the passage. When Ashenden had followed him, he stopped and locked the door, put the key in his pocket, and walked with Ashenden to his room. When they were inside it and the bolt drawn, Ashenden wiped his clammy hands and his forehead. "Thank God we're out of that!" There wasn't really the smallest danger. But what are we to do now? The colonel will be very angry that the papers haven't been found. I'm taking the 5 o'clock train to Rome. I shall wire for instructions there. Very well, I will come with you. I should have thought it would suit you better to get out of the country more quickly. There's a boat tomorrow that goes to Barcelona. Why don't you take that? And if necessary, I can come to see you there. The hairless Mexican gave a little smile. I see that you are anxious to be rid of me. Well, I won't thwart a wish that your inexperience in these matters excuses. I will go to Barcelona. I have a visa for Spain. Ashenden looked at his watch. It was a little after 2. He had nearly 3 hours to wait. His companion comfortably rolled himself a cigarette. What do you say to a little supper? He asked. I'm as hungry as a wolf. The thought of food sickened Ashenden, but he was terribly thirsty. He did not want to go out with the hairless Mexican, but neither did he want to stay in that hotel by himself. Where could one go at this hour? Come along with me, I'll find you a place. Ashenden put on his hat and took his dispatch case in his hand. They went downstairs. In the hall, the porter was sleeping soundly on a mattress on the floor. As they passed the desk, walking softly in order not to wake him, Ashenden noticed in the pigeonhole belonging to his room a letter. He took it out and saw that it was addressed to him. They tiptoed out of the hotel and shut the door behind them. Then they walked quickly away. Stopping after 100 yards or so under a lamppost, Ashenden took the letter out of his pocket and read it. It came from the consulate and said, "The enclosed telegram arrived tonight, and in case it is urgent, I am sending it round to your hotel by messenger." It had apparently been left some time before midnight. While Ashenden was sitting in his room, he opened the telegram and saw that it was in code. "Well, it'll have to wait," he said, putting it back in his pocket. The hairless Mexican walked as though he knew his way through the deserted streets, and Ashenden walked by his side. At last they came to a tavern in a blind alley, noisome and evil, and this the Mexican entered. "It's not the Ritz," he said, "but at this hour of the night, it's only in a place like this that we stand a chance for getting something to eat." Ashenden found himself in a long, sordid room, at one end of which a wizened young man sat at a piano. There were tables standing out from the wall on each side, and against them benches. A number of persons, men and women, were sitting about. They were drinking beer and wine. The women were old, painted and hideous, and their harsh gaiety was at once noisy and lifeless. When Ashenden and the hairless Mexican came in, they all stared, and when they sat down at one of the tables, Ashenden looked away in order not to meet the leering eyes, just ready to break into a smile that sought his insinuatingly. The wizened pianist strummed a tune, and several couples got up and began to dance. Since there were not enough men to go round, some of the women danced together. The general ordered 2 plates of spaghetti and a bottle of Capri wine. When the wine was brought, he drank a glassful greedily, and then, waiting for the pasta, eyed the women who were sitting at the other tables. "Do you dance?" he asked Ashenden. "I'm going to ask one of these girls to have a turn with me." He got up, and Ashenden watched him go up to one who had the least flashing eyes and white teeth to recommend her. She rose, and he put his arm around her. He danced well. Ashenden saw him begin talking. The woman laughed, and presently the look of indifference with which she had accepted his offer changed to one of interest. Soon they were chatting gaily. The dance came to an end, and putting her back at her table, he returned to Ashenden and drank another glass of wine. "What do you think of my girl?" he asked. "Not bad, is she? It does one good to dance. Why don't you ask one of them? This is a nice place, is it not? You can always trust me to find anything like this. I have an instinct." The pianist started again. The woman looked at the hairless Mexican, and when with his thumb he pointed to the floor, she jumped up with alacrity. He buttoned up his coat, arched his back, and standing by the side of the table, waited for her to come to him. He swung her off, talking, smiling, and already he was on familiar terms with everyone in the room. In fluent Italian, with his Spanish accent, he exchanged badinage with one and the other. They laughed at his sallies. Then the waiter brought 2 heaped platefuls of macaroni, and when the Mexican saw them, he stopped dancing without ceremony, and allowing his partner to get back to her table as she chose, hurried to his meal. "I'm ravenous," he said, "and yet I ate a good dinner. Where did you dine? You're going to eat some macaroni, aren't you?" "I have no appetite," said Ashenden. But he began to eat, and to his surprise, found that he was hungry. The hairless Mexican ate with huge mouthfuls, enjoying himself vastly. His eyes shone, and he was loquacious. The woman he had danced with had in that short time told him all about herself, and he repeated now to Ashenden what she had said. He stuffed huge pieces of bread into his mouth. He ordered another bottle of wine. "Wine?" he cried scornfully. "Wine is not a drink, only champagne. It does not even quench your thirst. Well, amigo, are you feeling better?" "I'm bound to say I am," smiled Ashenden. "Practice. That is all you want. Practice." He stretched out his hand to pat Ashenden on the arm. "What's that?" cried Ashenden with a start. "What's that stain on your cuff?" "That? Nothing. It's only blood. I had a little accident and cut myself." Ashenden was silent. His eyes sought the clock that hung over the door. "Are you anxious about your train? Let me have one more dance, and then I'll accompany you to the station." The Mexican got up, and with his sublime self-assurance seized in his arms the woman who sat nearest to him and danced away with her. Ashenden watched him moodily. He was a monstrous, terrible figure with that blonde wig and his hairless face. But he moved with a matchless grace. His feet were small and seemed to hold the ground like the pads of a cat or a tiger. His rhythm was wonderful, and you could not but see that the bedizened creature he danced with was intoxicated by his gestures. There was music in his toes and in the long arms that held her so firmly, and there was music in those long legs that seemed to move strangely from the hips. Sinister and grotesque though he was, there was in him now a feline elegance, even something of beauty, and you felt a secret, shameful fascination. To Ashenden, he suggested one of those sculptures of the pre-Aztec hewers of stone, in which there is barbarism and vitality, something terrible and cruel, and yet withal a brooding and significant loveliness. All the same, he would gladly have left him to finish the night by himself in that sordid dance hall, but he knew that he must have a business conversation with him. He did not look forward to it without misgiving. He had been instructed to give Manuel Carmona certain sums in return for certain documents. Well, the documents were not forthcoming, and as for the rest, Ashenden knew nothing about that. It was no business of his. The hairless Mexican waved gaily as he passed him. "I will come the moment the music stops. Pay the bill, and then I shall be ready." Ashenden wished he could have seen into his mind. He could not even make a guess at its workings. Then the Mexican, with his scented handkerchief wiping the sweat from his brow, came back. "Have you had a good time, General?" Ashenden asked him. "I always have a good time. Poor white trash, but what do I care? I like to feel the body of a woman in my arms and see her eyes grow languid and her lips part as her desire for me melts the marrow in her bones like butter in the sun. Poor white trash, but women." They sallied forth. The Mexican proposed that they should walk, and in that quarter, at that hour, there would have been little chance of finding a cab, but the sky was starry. It was a summer night, and the air was still. The silence walked beside them like the ghost of a dead man. When they neared the station, the houses seemed on a sudden to take on a grayer, more rigid line, and you felt that the dawn was at hand. A little shiver trembled through the night. It was a moment of apprehension, and the soul for an instant was anxious. It was as though, inherited down the years in their countless millions, it felt a witless fear that perhaps another day would not break. But they entered the station, and the night once more enwrapped them. One or two porters lolled about like stage hands after the curtain has rung down and the scene is struck. Two soldiers in dim uniforms stood motionless. The waiting room was empty, but Ashendon and the hairless Mexican went to sit in the most retired part of it. "I still have an hour before my train goes. I'll just see what this cable's about." He took it out of his pocket and from the dispatch case got his code. He was not then using a very elaborate one. It was in two parts, one contained in a slim book and the other given him on a sheet of paper and destroyed by him before he left Allied territory, committed to memory. Ashendon put on his spectacles and set to work. The hairless Mexican sat in a corner of the seat, rolling himself cigarettes and smoking. He sat there placidly, taking no notice of what Ashendon did, and enjoyed his well-earned repose. Ashendon deciphered the groups of numbers one by one, and as he got it, jotted down each word on a piece of paper. His method was to abstract his mind from the sense till he had finished, since he had discovered that if you took notice of the words as they came along, you often jumped to a conclusion and sometimes were led into error. So he translated quite mechanically, without paying attention to the words as he wrote them one after the other. When at last he had done, he read the complete message. It ran as follows: "Constantine Andreadi has been detained by illness at Piraeus. He will be unable to sail. Return Geneva and await instructions." At first, Ashendon could not understand. He read it again. He shook from head to foot. Then, for once robbed of his self-possession, he blurted out in a hoarse, agitated and furious whisper, "You bloody fool, you've killed the wrong man!"